thank Amherst College Library and the Center for Humanistic Inquiry here at Amherst for co-sponsoring this talk and helping bring people here. And I also want to thank the program committee of the library for helping set this up. And also Jane Beebe and Rebecca Henning and Kate Garrity, who all had conversations with me that helped me prepare for this panel. Welcome to Contested Subjects, the Politics of Library Classification. Some of you are familiar with some of the issues that we'll be talking with, and for others of you, this is kind of new stuff. I was introduced to the idea that there's a politic to how we think about library classification by Sanford Berman, who some people think of as kind of the patron saint of critical cataloging. Other people find him a very divisive figure. You can do more reading and decide for yourself. But he really did sort of get the ball rolling in the 1970s in terms of thinking about the library catalog and library classification in general, and the focus on human and civil rights as expressed through the language and classification schemes in the Library of Congress, at least as far as United States classification goes. And also, thanks to Sanford Berman, zine is now an official Library of Congress subject term. And so is third wave feminism, transgender people, two-spirit people, prison and industrial complex, plutocracy, and also library cats. So we have many things to be thankful to him for. But the conversation has really continued since the 1970s about how classification relates to human and civil rights. And also, it's evolved to include the voices of many more kinds of people, and recently including people like Hope Olson and K.R. Roberto, our panelists, and also other people who are considering library classification practices, mechanisms, and the cultural consequences and meanings of these practices. Some of the questions that we think about are how do we devise reliable systems that provide broad access to information, but that also allow for ongoing development and changing understandings of experience? How do we help people looking for information understand and evaluate how these systems themselves are functioning? How do communities challenge and rethink classification structures, categorization and institutional efforts to organize and disseminate information, particularly in relationship to people's own histories, their knowledge, and the things that they themselves know to be true? So all these questions relate to conversations we've been having here at Amherst College in the library, both in the Research and Instruction Department, which I'm part of, and the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and also other people also thinking about these things. So I really am excited about bringing people to help us think about these issues and talk about their own work in relationship to this. So I'm really glad to welcome and introduce John DeSantis, Alana Kumbir, Kelsey Shepard, and Emily Drabinsky. And I'll just read your short bios. So Alana Kumbir is the Critical Social Inquiry and Digital Pedagogy Librarian at Hampshire College. She is currently co-teaching Beyond the Riot, Zines in Archives and Digital Space, a 5-college digital humanities course. She has published work on queer archives, disability justice, and libraries, and the intersection of critical pedagogy and library instruction. Her current research is on sexuality materials and sexuality education in libraries. I also have her book here, if you want to look at it. Emily Drabinsky is coordinator of library instruction at Long Island University, Brooklyn. She sits on the board of Radical Teacher, a journal of socialist, feminist, and anti-racist teaching practice, and edits Gender and Sexuality in Information Studies, a book series from Library Juice Press and Whitman Books. John DeSantis has been cataloging and metadata services librarian at Dartmouth College since 1998. Prior to that, he held 2 positions in technical services at the Amherst College Library. Within American Library Association, he has served on CCDA, the Committee on Cataloging, Description, and Access, and SAC, the Subject Analysis Committee, as well as other committees. He is in his 2nd term on the IFLA Subject Analysis and Access Committee, and he's been a delegate to OCLC Global Council since 2011 and served on ALA Council since 2004. He's currently a member of the ALA Executive Board. And Kelsey Shepard, who just recently left us, is the DPLA Network Manager at the Digital Public Library of America, where she's working to maintain, expand, and build community within DPLA's network of hubs. Prior to joining the DPLA, she was the head of digital programs at Amherst College. Kelsey is on the steering committee for the Digital Atlas of Native American Intellectual Traditions, a project funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services to plan a framework for sharing, exploring, and visualizing library and archival collections of native authored materials intended for public audiences. And lastly, you can't see her now, but I'm glad that Reed Gotchberg is able to join us. She'll be helping to guide the post-panel discussion later. And Reed is a postdoctoral fellow at Amherst College in the Center for Humanistic Inquiry. She received her PhD in English from Boston University and is currently working on a project about 19th century American literature and the formation of scientific museum collections. So help us in welcoming our panelists and we'll get started.
Good afternoon, nice to see you all here. Looks like a great audience. Thank you, Sara, for the invitation to be on this panel. As I was driving down this afternoon, it occurred to me that 25 years ago this month, I came to Amherst for the very first time to interview for a position at this library, which I eventually accepted and worked here for a number of years, as Sara indicated. I have not been back here for a very long time, so it's actually very moving for me to be here. So I'm going to talk about Library of Congress subject headings and how they handle what I call special communities, and you'll see what I mean by that. And also talk about a particular case study that I was heavily involved with over the past couple of years. And you can see from the little quote here what the issue is that I'll be talking mostly about. Subject terminology used to describe groups of people can seem innocuous and acceptable in one era and evolve over time into terms which are viewed as offensive or outdated for various reasons. And there's been a long history of this in LCSH. So in my examples here, the italics indicate a former heading that's been replaced by a newer heading. So you can see some rather well-known examples of outdated headings that have been replaced with more current terminology. So probably the most well-known example of a heading of this sort that's changed over time, the heading Negroes, which I believe was replaced by Afro-Americans in the 1980s, and then eventually was replaced by both African-Americans and blacks, two headings which are used differently, and if anyone's curious, we can probably talk more about that later.
I am curious.
What's that?
I am curious.
Okay, good. And then we have valid headings that coexist with one another as narrow terms or broader terms of one another, but still outdated. Deaf is not really a useful catalog term because we're talking about deaf people. Same with blind, we should be saying blind people. Some people think that people with visual disabilities is the same thing as blind, but blind people is actually a narrow term of a larger concept. So this brings us to the illegal aliens saga. How many of you have read about it, heard about it, know about it? Everybody, okay. All right, well, then you're going to get the inside scoop then. So this is how it all started, before Ted Cruz got his hands on it. So early in 2014, a group of Dartmouth students, some of whom self-identify as undocumented immigrants, formed a group known as Co-Fired, and you can see up there what that stands for. Their mission was to advance the rights of undocumented students at Dartmouth and in the United States. Shortly after the founding of the organization, the group submitted a manifesto of demands to the college administration, which included these 2 points above. Notice the second one, the library search catalog system shall use undocumented instead of illegal. So we were absolutely fascinated by this request, not so much that they were demanding a change, but oh my God, the students are using the library catalog and they're looking at subject headings. So the library administration decided to respond to this. So we were not able to well, maybe it's not so obvious as I'll talk about later, but we did not make a immediate change in our local catalog in response to this request. What we did is we formed a group of librarians, administrators, and students from Co-Fired, and we got together to talk about the options on how we could address their concerns and needs. So it was kind of like an educating session, and we talked about the best way to do that would be at the source. The heading Illegal Aliens is a Library of Congress subject heading. The best way to do it would be to ask the Library of Congress to change it, which they readily accepted and agreed with. So, because Dartmouth is a member of the PCC, which is the Program for Cooperative Cataloging administered by the Library of Congress, we were able to submit a subject heading change proposal through SACO, the Subject Authority Cooperative Program. So we submitted a proposal to change illegal aliens to undocumented immigrants. And this is what our proposal looked like after it reached the offices in LC, and you can see their little marks in pen as they were looking at that. And so basically, that was what we did. We submitted it, and then we had to wait for the decision. While we were waiting, the students really thought this was great, that we had submitted a proposal to LC on their behalf, so they started publicizing this. The story got picked up in the local Dartmouth press, campus publications, and then eventually in the local newspaper. And the local newspaper actually did a front page story on it with my name on the front page of the local newspaper. They interviewed me at great length. It was very interesting. And I only bring this up because once something gets in the local newspaper, it's out there. So then some library publications started picking this up. The library media got wind of the story. Even Library of Congress staff outside of SACO took notice of the news article in the Dartmouth publication and sent me personal messages of support. So we were very optimistic. And picking up on, Sara mentioned Sandy Berman. How many of you have heard of Sandy Berman? Several of you had. Okay, so catalogers, Sara said some catalogers think of him as the patron saint. I think most catalogers would think of him as like the Bernie Sanders of cataloging. He's been an activist for his entire career. He worked in Hennepin County Library System in Minnesota, and for many years they published their own bulletin, the Hennepin County Library Bulletin, which this library subscribed to for the whole time that it was in print. It was a listing of new subject headings that LC would not approve, but they are putting into use. It was actually very useful. And his voice, he's now retired, long retired, but his voice does still carry some weight at LC, and he very helpfully lent his support for our proposal, which I should say was unbeknownst to me at the time. I only found out after the fact that he was sending these communiques to LC on our behalf, which is very nice. LC took a very long time to respond to this proposal, and when they did finally respond, in the first half of 2015, this is what they said. If you can read the bottom line, the proposals were not approved. They cited a couple of compelling reasons. The main thing is that within their controlled vocabulary structure, undocumented immigrants and illegal aliens, they're not, it's not a trade-off. It would involve a lot of moving things around and canceling and replacing other headings. The other reason they cited is that illegal aliens is used by the Congressional Research Service, and it's considered a legal term within the U.S. government, and so they didn't want to go any further with that. Well, obviously, there was a great deal of disappointment on the part of the students who initiated the request, and adding salt to the wound was, again, unbeknownst to me, an article published by Sandy Berman in the Unabashed Librarian in which he criticized my library for not making the local accommodation initially. As you can see that Bakerberry could have executed the nomenclature change for their own catalog. They chose not to. Yes, that is absolutely correct. And those of you who are cataloging managers or who even work in cataloging are well aware of the reasons why a library could not feasibly do this. So we thought that was the end of it, but no. Enter the American Library Association. So a colleague of mine named Tina Gross, coincidentally also from Minnesota, who served with me on the subject analysis committee, didn't want to let this go. She actually galvanized various units within ALA, and a resolution was brought before the ALA Council in January of this year. The resolution passed easily, and you can see the resolve clause there. Resolved that the American Library Association, on behalf of its members, urges the Library of Congress to change the subject heading illegal aliens to undocumented immigrants. Very specific. Things like this never, I'm on ALA Council, things like this never go before ALA Council. This is extraordinary that we pass this resolution without any opposition or any real discussion. So off it went to the Library of Congress. We thought they would say, oh, that's very nice, thank you very much. And that would be, but no. In March of this year, out of the blue, following a meeting of high-level administrators at LC, apparently in response to the ALA resolution, a new decision was issued. And notice that this new decision begins with the phrase, in response to constituent requests. And this is just the first part of that document. They later go on to acknowledge that the request originated by a group of Dartmouth students, which was very nice. So the decision was that they will indeed retire the term illegal aliens, but not replace it with undocumented immigrants, because that still doesn't work for them. They came up with their own solution. Two subject headings, non-citizens and unauthorized immigration used jointly. So this is what they're, for you, if you want to geek out on authority records, you catalogers in the room, this is what it looks like. They are canceling the heading aliens altogether, proposing the new heading non-citizens. This is the record for non-citizens. Illegal aliens and undocumented immigrants then become cross-references to non-citizens. So this has not yet been implemented, but this is what will be implemented once it actually happens, we hope. So again, big media explosion following LC's decision to cancel illegal aliens. Everybody picked up on it. Radio, television, newspapers, blogs. It was really very surprising. And so here's some examples of some of the headlines. Even the Spanish language press got a hold of it. So it was a double-edged sword because it got so much publicity. You know where this is going. If you've been following the story, a Republican legislator from Tennessee took notice and tried to stop this from happening. So yes, it actually happened in May 2016. The House Appropriations Committee passed a funding bill which instructs the Library of Congress to continue using illegal aliens. It was unbelievable that they would spend their time on LC subject headings, but yes, that actually happened. And here's some more sample headlines of what happened following that story. And I'm so happy that I connected with the ALA Washington office, which is how I got a copy of this letter, that was sent to the Librarian of Congress at the time, signed by a couple of senators, including Ted Cruz, and I think this is before he dropped out of the race. This is the first time that Congress has involved itself in the cataloging policy of Library of Congress. There's so much publicity that came out of this, negative publicity, that the public was manipulated. They thought it meant something other than it did. There was a woman who went on television and said, an illegal alien killed my son, so how could the Library of Congress change this heading? It created there was a perception by the public and the lawmakers themselves that the Library of Congress is the ultimate arbiter of English language usage, that a subject heading change enshrines the term as a legal entity for all eternity. That's what they don't understand what this is. This is just a heading in a catalog, but they thought it had much more import than it does. So the saga continues. LC has not yet made the change. The bill is expected to go before Congress in November. The ALA Washington office is hopeful that the LC issue will be removed from the bill before voting. If that happens, then LC will be able to implement the change. So I'm cautiously optimistic. So that was that saga. But what's next? So what is the one area that LC has not been addressing in terms of special populations that they could be? And this is a very well-known example, and some of you knew I was going to talk about this. Indians of North America. So you know that the term that is most commonly used is, especially for indigenous peoples in the United States, is Native Americans. But LC continues to use Indians of North America. I do predict this will be the next area that they will draw their attention to, or spend their attention on. Terminology used for and by Native Americans and indigenous peoples is a current topic of interest. There is a recent Cataloging and Classification quarterly issue devoted entirely to that topic. This summer, I organized and chaired a program on this very topic at IFLA as well. I think such a change like this, with all of the related headings, it would involve a major overhaul of authority records and many bibliographic records as well. A lot of bibliographic maintenance. But I do hope it's a change that I will see before I retire. So I've just touched on a few things. Maybe we can talk more about this during the discussion afterwards. So I'm gonna.
I'm going to be taking a little bit of a different tactic. I'm going to talk specifically about a collection here at Amherst College and a project that is growing up around it. It's called the Kim Waite Eisenberg Native American Literature Collection, which has inspired this project called the Digital Atlas of Native American Intellectual Traditions, soon to be renamed because we've gotten pushback on pretty much every word, except for maybe the and of. But that's okay. That's actually what we were seeking. So I'm going to focus specifically on what a project like this might mean for the kinds of cataloging systems and tools that we're here to talk about today. And before I get started, I really want to say that I'm up here as a representative, a stand-in really for a lot of people who have put a lot of great ideas into this, who have put a lot of work into this. So first of all, here at Amherst College, Mike, the head of Archives and Special Collections, who put everything in place to acquire the collection and who first suggested the idea of building a digital atlas. Rebecca, the real cataloger. I don't even play a cataloger on TV. The real cataloger who worked with the collection and explained to me the details of the issues that she faced. Lisa and Kiara, Native Studies scholars and faculty here at Amherst, whose research and teaching were the impetus for acquiring the collection and who have been incredible partners throughout this project. And Hari, one of our two amazing facilitators at a planning meeting we held this summer, who was instrumental in its success. And Sara, who also joined us to be a facilitator and got off the hook a little bit because we let things evolve in a different way as they needed to out of the room, but who also has been really supportive throughout this entire project. And then there are a lot of people who've participated in the project outside of Amherst, and I'm going to talk more about that in a bit. So in August 2013, Amherst College acquired one of the most comprehensive collections of books by Native American authors that had ever been assembled by a private collector. Nearly 1,400 works of fiction, poetry, history, philosophy, sermons, anthropological works, photography, activist manifestos, science fiction, books for children, and more. And the library continues to expand this collection. The Archives and Special Collections are continuing to expand the collection with the aim of documenting as thoroughly as possible the full spectrum of Native American writing and intellectual life from the 18th century to the present. And I just want to highlight that 18th century. This is the earliest work in the collection. It was published in 1772. It's a sermon by an author named Samuel Occam. And 1772 is long before most people know that Native Americans were engaging in intellectual thought in the public sphere in this way. So when the collection came in, Rebecca immediately started to catalog it. And she and Mike knew this would be used for teaching and that students may want to study authors who, from specific tribal communities, to be able to find works by authors from specific tribal communities. So they wanted to identify that in the catalog record. Until recently, there was no place for this in the authority record. So for the non-librarians in the room, that's the information in the catalog about the author themselves. That has recently been added, the ability to put some sort of affiliation, organizational or other affiliation, but that didn't used to be in place. So that's recent within the last few years. Even when that information does exist, it is not always accurate. So they had to use a lot of external sources to find this information and to try to find it in an accurate way. They also needed to find a place for this in the bibliographic record because the way our systems work, you don't see the things in those authority records. You couldn't search by what's in an authority record and have it linked to the book or other work itself. So they put it in a local genre field, which the librarians in the room will know isn't really the appropriate place for it, but it needed to go in the record, and something is better than nothing, and so we can all let go of that a little bit. One of the other things that it meant to put that in the record about the book as opposed to the record about the author was that if there were two authors, there was no way to specify which tribal affiliation went with which author, or if an author had more than one tribal community that they were a member of, how would you do that? So there's some limitations, but really trying to work within the existing systems we have to do better than might have otherwise been done. And one thing I would say is, even for something like Gorky Park, which probably no other library in the world identifies that author's tribal affiliation, because the book isn't about, it's about a spy novel set in Russia. We identified that, Rebecca identified that in the catalog record. Some of the other issues that arose were the tribal community's preferred name might not be the one that's listed in LCSH. So, for example, Lakota was only recently added to Library of Congress subject headings. Since we got the collection in 2013, that's been added. And there are a lot of other groups that aren't listed at all or aren't listed with their preferred name. In addition, classification for literature is based on modern geographic boundaries. So for groups such as the Haudenosaunee, which cross modern political boundaries, the books by authors, Haudenosaunee authors who are from the United States and who are from Canada won't actually be shelved together in the stacks. So, cataloging issues. We also ran into issues when we began to digitize materials in the collection. So we decided to go ahead and digitize because these were published materials. They were intended for a public audience, as opposed to things like artifacts or other things that have been shared inappropriately. They're also from all over the country, and so Amherst is far from a lot of the communities that these authors came from, communities that might be interested in these works. So we wanted to make them accessible. We did start to digitize, basically just starting from the oldest and going up as far as we could. I think this is still an ongoing project. 1923 is the cutoff, as many librarians will know, for published works where they stop being in the public domain. So after that, we'd have to pursue permissions and that sort of thing. So some of the issues that we ran into with digitization were that we were following Western intellectual property laws, which are really about ownership, but there are other cultural issues that could be related to content in the collections, and in the books themselves, that we also need to think about. And our system, and most systems for digital collections at this point, provide static access. So the system doesn't contextualize, it doesn't allow multiple perspectives, it doesn't allow a Mohegan person to come and make statements about the Samuel Occam sermon based on their tribal knowledge, so it doesn't allow multiple voices to add information or metadata to the record. And it also doesn't provide visualization to reveal networks and connections between the authors and the places that they lived or wrote about, among the authors themselves, between authors and publishers or schools, and revealing those connections, especially connections to place, was the impetus for Mike's idea of the digital atlas. So we had the seed of an idea, but we wanted to build it in a way that would plug into existing efforts, would integrate with other digital collections, other kinds of projects that were being conceived, and that wouldn't reinvent the wheel. So we went to the IMLS and we got a planning grant, specifically because we wanted to have broad input from the beginning. We wanted to be collaborative. We knew there was a lot that we didn't know, or I should speak for myself, I knew there was a lot I didn't know. Mike had already begun to connect with Native communities here in the Northeast, but we wanted to continue building those relationships and also expanding that network into other areas as well. So that whole idea of building relationships, building a human network, was actually a specifically stated goal in the grant. I've never asked IMLS what they think about that, but it was a specifically stated outcome of the grant. And here are some of the partners. This is our steering committee. The Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums is a really important organization providing support for tribal archives, libraries, and museums. They do a conference every year. Mike and I are going next week to present. The Makutu project is an open source digital asset management system that really does think about indigenous information and having different kinds of access protocols for indigenous information. So we had some great people on the steering committee. And the big activity of the grant was a meeting that we held here at Amherst College in June. And I'm going to give you the grant version of what that meeting was about, and then I'll tell you what I think the meeting was about. So in grant speak, the meeting brought together Native studies scholars, Native librarians, tribal historians, representatives from libraries with large Native authored collections, metadata, digital humanities, and user interface specialists, and technologists to discuss a framework for sharing, exploring, and visualizing library and archival collections of Native authored materials intended for a public audience. That, I barely got through that sentence. But not that I don't want to denigrate that, because I think that it's really important, but that is grant speak, right? This is something you tell grantors. And then in reality, what we did was bring together a group of people to envision the possibility of pulling together printed materials by Native American authors that are held in many different collections, to think about how we would address the limitations of Western metadata systems, and how we could use digital humanities methodologies, things like mapping and social network analysis, to help provide context and increase understanding. And as it evolved throughout the two-day meeting, how would you use indigenous or indigenizing methodologies to build such a system? Which, as you can tell, I think that last question is a very powerful one. And it really was one that grew out of the meeting. It came organically. And again, this is why we did a planning grant, to get all of those voices, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different communities represented. And that idea could have only come out of bringing such a group together. So what would a system like that look like? A system that was built from the ground up using indigenizing methodologies. We're actually really still answering that question. We're thinking about it and documenting what came out of the meeting right now. We're presenting that in more detail next week. But the group really coalesced around the idea of a decentralized organizational and technological network of digital collections of Native American writing and other statements intended for the public sphere. I think the decentralization is important, and the idea of the network is important. And it's not just a computer network, it's a human network, it's an organizational network. The values and the methodologies that we heard repeatedly over the course of the 2 days included the idea of reciprocity, consultation with tribal communities, the ability to follow linkages among different works in different collections, linkages between works and places, between works and authors and publishers, between works and ancestral knowledge, the idea of contextualization, of sustainability, and of collaboration. And we also heard we were basically given permission to take this slow and do it well. There are a lot of models out there for digital collections, and we could just adopt one and plop it down in this space, and it would be, I think, a very different kind of project. So we were kind of given permission to move in a staged way and do this right. Most importantly, an idea that arose was to put relationality at the center of this kind of system. This is a chart that our facilitators developed during the meeting, but I would like to credit Sandy Littletree for the concept of putting relationality at the center of systems design. This concept is based on PhD research she's doing in information science at the University of Washington. So where traditional, and by that I mean Western or colonial library systems, put the stuff in the middle, the books, the archives, Sandy's thinking on indigenous systems design puts relationality at the center. So, for example, relationality among the people, organizations, and communities involved in the project itself, relationality among authors, books, and native ways of thinking, relationality among past, present, and future, and even relationality as a guiding concept in how we manage the project and design the system. So I'm actually still very new to all of these concepts, to this concept of using indigenizing methodologies for systems design and what relationality really means in this context. But it is such a powerful approach that I'm finding these ideas are making their way into other work that I'm doing as well. Still, since I am new to this, I feel like I should probably be the last person up here representing this work, and I don't think of myself as a representative. I'm just sharing with you what came out of these conversations by this group of people who've been working and thinking in this space for a lot longer than I have. So I'd like to close just by once again recognizing and thanking the people who are informing, inspiring, and influencing the project and are shaping my own thinking and my work beyond the boundaries of the project itself.
Hey, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for asking me, Sarah. And I'm so excited by the ways in which, even though we're talking about different things, I'm hearing connections that we can just build on. So what I'm talking about this afternoon is a much smaller, tiny project that really happens in a room. Very little. And basically, I'm thinking about these classification practices that happen outside of conventional library systems. And it's this practice that I'm referring to and others refer to as community cataloging. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about groups of volunteers who are not trained catalogers who get together and describe library materials in a collaborative, participatory setting, in the case of the group that I work with, using a Google spreadsheet, so that we're literally all in the document together at once, cataloging. And in my life, the way this looks is that for the past few years, I've been part of a group of volunteer librarians at the Flywheel Zine Library, which is part of a community art space in East Hampton. And the library at Flywheel is open to the public during Flywheel-hosted events, which could be a punk show, it could be a children's dance party, it could be a pancake breakfast. This morning we brought the class. There was a lot of coffee, stuff sloshing around, not a preservation environment or a conventional library. And what we're doing is in the zine library, we're cataloging. Several of you I know are zine librarians and are familiar with zines, but for those who aren't, we're cataloging materials like this. So zines are these small, self-produced, independent publications. The print runs are, like maybe into the hundreds. A huge zine would maybe get into the thousands, the low thousands. A real fancy zine would be like Dishwasher that had a nice like silkscreen cover. Or, we have a zine like this, The Renegade's Handbook to Love and Sabotage, where you can see there's like a nice ribbon binding, watercolor, really beautiful. Like the line between zine and artist book gets kind of blurred here. And then a lot of things that, like this issue of Mamacita, which is clearly produced like on a copier. So that the idea is that the means of production here are not expensive. Maybe you could, steal them from work or however. And that they're, so they're small run, usually a few dollars a piece, not made for profit. And they're materials that, are not necessarily made or intended for libraries. At least many of the ones that we have at Flywheel, that was maybe not their purpose to be in a library or an archive initially. So what happens at Flywheel is that every other week we get together, we have an evening dinner, which, surprise, is a vegetarian potluck, community punk space. And it's followed by, a couple of hours of everyone just sitting around and cataloging. So this is a multi-year project. There are over 2,400 zines, and more are on the way all the time. And the idea of what we're doing is we're just trying to get a hold of the inventory, so what's in the library, and also so that when groups like the class that visited this morning come, they can look in our spreadsheet, which is our catalog, and try to find zines related to their interests. And when we catalog zines at Flywheel, what we're doing sort of resembles the work that happens in a conventional library in that we're assigning everything a subject, so it has a place to go on the shelf. And we're trying to describe the materials based on what we see in front of us. So the material itself guides our description. But it's got a really low barrier to access. It's a Google form. Within about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you all could be cataloging a zine if I had enough. And that's how we were using our time. And the subject categories are really straightforward, like feminism, politics, humor. It's not hard to understand what we're looking at. And in addition to the subject terms, we add keywords, sort of like tagging, so that we can say what each zine is about. And this really works because we have like about 10 boxes of zines in the category personal. And without those kind of tags, without those keywords, we wouldn't know, is this a personal zine about being a first-generation American? Is this a personal zine about being deaf? Is this about your pinball enthusiasm? All of those are there. And for a really concrete example, one of the zines we have is Elvis Bakaitis' Homos and Herstory, which is a mini comic about LGBTQ folks in different decades of the 20th century. And so we need to find a place for that on the shelf. So should it go with the queer zines? Should it go with the history zines? Should it go in the comics? It could be in any of those places. And because the one issue can't exist in all those places, we have to figure out where it's going to go. So we use the key terms. It went actually into culture. That's where someone put it. And then we use the terms to note that this is, queer. It's got women of color. Intersectionality is an issue, so someone coming could find all of those things. And part of what's nice about cataloging in the room with other people is this collective knowledge situation. Last night we were working and someone had an issue of a zine called Rad Dad, which is like a radical parenting zine. And we don't have a parenting box. We don't have anything like that. So there was a lot of debate. Like, is this feminism? Because it's feminist informed. Is it culture? Someone was wondering, like, should it go in sex and relationships? Because it is a relationship. But then we thought, no, probably not that. But, is it politics? Yeah, for the moment we were thinking, well, maybe we could put it in culture, and then because we're in the room and we have this flexibility, we could just say, well, actually, I guess we need a parenting category. So that one gets created. So as the example suggests, these zines demand specific practices. And it's collective work, and we're consulting each other quite a lot. The other thing that is true is that we exist in a wider community of zine librarians and other people who are engaged in these practices. So this is not just something that's happening in East Hampton. And the thing that I think is distinct in some ways about zines, and then now as we're hearing these panels, I'm thinking it's not all that distinct about zines. And the kind of cataloging that we do is that we're also really accountable to creators, and that this is something that's true across zine librarianship, more so even than users or researchers. So often when we're cataloging, we're really thinking about what does the creator want, and that relationship is centered. And I find that the Zine Librarian's Code of Ethics is really helpful for framing the situation. And I'm just going to read this preamble because I love it. But it states that we, the community of zine librarians and archivists, believe that because zines are often produced by members of marginalized communities, because we strive to respectfully engage with and represent those communities, because librarians and archivists are often part of the communities that make and read zines, because the material itself, so beautifully and wonderfully varied, is often weird, ephemeral, magical, dangerous, and emotional, and because we reject the myth of library or archival neutrality, therefore, we want to be accountable to our users, our institutions, our authors, donors, and communities. So the statement kind of helps us think about ways that zines are different from mass-produced books. They're self-produced, they don't go through peer editing, maybe the creator is the editor, that's usually what happens. They might have been made really painstakingly over a long period of time, or someone might have made them like in a few hours. They might be distributed through, an online distributor or through a bookstore, but it's just as likely they're being handed off like one-to-one, or who you're giving your zine to. And as feminist zine scholar Alison Pipemeyer observed, zines matter a lot in terms of process as well as product. So often if you spend time with zines, you'll come across some where you see people have crossed out ideas and written in other ones, or they've added some text later, or there's a whiteout. You can tell that we are seeing a record of someone's thinking over time, their process, their growth. And if you look at issue 5 of a zine and issue 17, you may discover a different person, in the years that have passed is writing. And I'm going to make just, a little relevant digression here, which was that recently in the middle of a move, I was looking in this accordion file at my house that has my 1990s zine papers, because I'm teaching the 1990s class. And I found the first issue of the zine that I made back in 1995, and it had a comic I completely didn't remember making. It had several articles I did not remember at all. And I looked at them and I was like, that's me. It was my life there. I know I did it. But I had absolutely no memory of having done any of that. And I understood at a new level the feeling people sometimes have when they discover that their work has entered a library, and that it's showing up in WorldCat because it's been cataloged. And if you look me up in WorldCat now, you'll see the book. You'll see some zines I made recently that I sold to people bought them and I knew that was happening. But I would be really upset actually if I saw my old zines there suddenly with a really detailed record of what I was writing about at that time. And so in the 80s and 90s, and even now, I think a lot of zine folks don't anticipate the possibility of their zines ending up in a catalog, nor do they necessarily anticipate the idea that we might want to digitize them and share them online. A lot of people, when they were making zines years ago and now, didn't want to associate the zine with a government name, have changed names, have used many aliases over time, which becomes really tricky for authority control and ethics. And so we're making all of this information available via a catalog search and then, by extension, an internet search. So this is a place where we've had to think a lot about how do we make our records revisable? How do we listen to people and value what they ask and respect wishes when people want us to take something down or change something? We are lucky at Flywheel in that, we have our spreadsheet. It's really easy to change. We get into a really different situation when we're talking about finding aids and collections at Barnard and larger places where the stuff is in a catalog. So what's happening at Flywheel is, I think, just really obviously in ways that are not hidden. It's interpretive, it's imperfect. No one went to library school to be a cataloger who's there. And several people in the room aren't affiliated with libraries at all. They're not library workers. But the community knowledge is part of what helps. This is also what limits us. If you get a lot of people in the room who are very similar and are drawn to zines because it's part of a subculture they're familiar with, we can do a great job of describing zines by people like us, but you can guess where our limitations lie, right? The other thing I wanted to mention, just thinking about this in the way that when we had students in my class catalog zines using a very similar system, things I had never really thought about came up when the students started talking about their experience. Like, when we do these zine nights, maybe we catalog a bunch of zines, or maybe we catalog one or two. The students were really observing that it took them 45 minutes to catalog a zine. And then they were thinking about books in the library and the time that that takes for a person to catalog a book. And do people really have that time? And what does this mean? And what does it mean that the person cataloging the book isn't the same identity or background as the author of the book? And a lot of questions about time and labor and identity enter the picture. And at Flywheel, it's important to recognize that no one's getting paid. It's free. No one has money to buy tools. And we're super inefficient. 2,400 zines, many years. And I think that there's something, I don't know quite yet what, but I just want to observe that part of the benefit of this is also there's a cataloging for pleasure, which is a really different practice than cataloging for work. And, and there's today in class when we were talking, one thing that came up was the idea too that if you spend an hour cataloging a zine because you're reading it really, or 2 hours, then you know your collection super well, and that's the beautiful bubble of the Flywheel. So while we can think about some other systems that maybe act as universal, try to act a little more as if they're neutral systems. The spreadsheet, part of what's exciting about it is that it is really particular. It represents this one local zine community. And last night I actually heard someone, it was perfect for getting ready for this paper, someone actually said the words out loud, "I feel so free," adding these tags to the That is exactly what I wanted to hear. That it's a freeing practice, that it's an empowering practice. And that we're proud to describe zines using terms that we trust are appropriate, they're ethical, we can revise them later. Because the zines we make often make their way to us directly from their authors, and many of those authors are local to the Valley, I appreciate that we can email them and say, what do you think? What pronoun? What name? What's happening with you now? Is it the same as it used to be? And that, if we make a mistake, we can revise our thinking about a classification choice. So we have our key goals to inventory the zines and make them more accessible, but the product of that work, the spreadsheet, and Emily, I'm leading right into you here, also functions as a text, right? It's a record of our vocabularies, our decisions, our compromises, and our best guesses. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much to Sara for inviting me. I am someone in the midst of a protracted labor dispute that I'm going to do my best not to talk about while I'm up here, but Sara said I would get a little break from that, and I have. These stories are fascinating. So I come at cataloging and classification a little bit differently, and I am forever, and for the last 10 years and probably for the rest of my life, will be really interested in the paradox that I'm going to present to you that I hope you will help me continue to think through in the question and answer period. So you have to have one, right? You have to have a cataloging and classification structure. Otherwise, you have a big pile of books in a room, like a garbage rubble pile, and if you want a book about protracted labor disputes, you have to go through every single book in the pile looking for one that looks right, okay? So in order to stop that from happening and make some books accessible to people, what libraries have done, have developed classification and cataloging structures. Those are two different things. This is how I understand them, and I'm glad that there's some catalogers here who can help me understand. Classification puts a book in a category, an intellectual category, and it fits it on a shelf, right? So just like Alana was talking about, you can't put the zine everywhere. This is a condition of material reality, right? I am consumed right now by material reality. So, the book has to live somewhere, and we have to put it in an intellectual category. That category is its classification. So as a lesbian myself, I think a lot about classification of lesbian, description of lesbian materials, and those go in the HQs, right? Which I love, right? And this is the paradox, right? I love it because we're together, right? And the category is necessary for me to come into social being, right? If I wanted to live alone in a hole as a lesbian, I wouldn't need the classification, but I don't, all right? I want to go on dates and I want to have relationships and friendships, and so the category is necessary. What's the problem with the HQ category? It's like social problems, right? Like, so lesbians are classified as a social problem, right? And while, you know, maybe that's true, right? It's also not true, right? Yeah, right? I'm like doing my best to be a huge problem right now. But anyway, so you've got a social problem. Okay, so that's the classification. And I think a lot of work has been done in libraries and in critical cataloging to talk about moving and changing those categories, right? So for example, transgender people used to be in the section of the catalog for people with mental illness, right? And now they are part of the social problem, right? So they're like moved, right? But there are attempts to remedy that, okay? So that's like one area of sort of protracted problem. The other area is cataloging, which is descriptive language, and it's linked, right? So the term is tied to the category, right? And so they're related, but I think they're separate problems. So descriptive language, so the things that John was talking about, having offensive subject headings in the catalog. So that I go to the catalog and I have to say lesbian, even though really I identify as femme and queer, and then those words aren't available to me in the catalog, and that's problematic. So I don't identify as femme. That was an example. It's not about me. So it was totally about me, right? I mean, I think these questions are personal and political, right? So tons of work has been done to correct subject headings, right, and to correct that language and make it not say illegal aliens, right? So that's problematic. We want to change that terminology. So I'm really interested in the project you were talking about, Kelsey, about using a totally different knowledge organization approach to making those kinds of classification decisions. So this is what we have. We have classification and cataloging, and they're problematic, and we need to fix them. But we can't do without them, right? So the problem I have is that there are historical legacies permeating those, right? And so we need to correct for the bad actors of the past. So I'm really glad there are some historians in the room, right? Like, are we the people who are not bad actors? This is my issue with Sandy Berman, right? Like, Sandy Berman has done incredible work to sort of correct subject headings so that they are not offensive. But is Sandy Berman's, like, his language, perfect language, correct language, will it be perfect and correct language in 100 years? Probably not. Like, I don't have the hubris that I imagine that my ideology is the right ideology, right? So, I mean, it is. And we're going to win. But it's also not, right? So it's not. And so if all sort of the construction of all categories and all language is ideological and it can't be corrected, what are we going to do? So that's like the paradox for me. It's like I have to have these categories and this language in order to come into social being, which I want to do, but it's problematic and ideologically informed, and it can't be fixed. So that's the problem. Okay, so tons and tons of solutions have been proposed to this problem, right? First are things like indigenous knowledge organization as an approach, right? So the cataloging and classification quarterly issue, if you're at all interested in this that John mentioned about indigenous knowledge, totally riveting, every word of it, you should go and read it, right? So there are solutions that are about centering different forms of knowledge. There are technical solutions and lots of them. So things like in your catalog, rotating the first subject heading so that things are described in a variety of different ways in your catalog. Things like user tagging, okay? So everyone can enhance a record with their own language, which makes the record more available. So there are some problems with that, right? Has anyone ever added a tag to anything in your life? Right? You have? Okay, so there are some people do that, but it's not a very active practice. And often when we tag things, we're tagging them for ourselves. So the most popular tag on Flickr, does anybody know? Me, right? Me, right? Because I want to find pictures of me. So tagging has problems in those ways. Tagging is also labor. So the other solution is to just enhance the catalog record with 24 more subject headings that fully amplify everything about the record. But we can't actually spend 45 minutes per book given the volume of books that come through the library, right? So that's not a tenable solution. So I'm really hyper aware of labor issues right this second because I'm involved in a protracted labor dispute. But what it means, I think, is that I have some respect for the amount of work it takes to do a catalog record, and you can't do it endlessly. Cataloging is also done by humans. My first job out of library school was as an indexer at the H.W. Wilson Index. I see some, did anybody else work there? I worked on the social science index, and every morning at 10 a.m. they would wheel a coffee cart down the hallway and ring a cowbell. And then you could get up, you were allowed to get up out of your seat, come to the hallway, and you'd pay them a quarter, they'd give you a styrofoam cup of coffee. 10 minutes later, they would ring the cowbell again, and you went back to your cubicle, right? And we had a 40 record quota, was our sort of labor conditions, right? And so it didn't put me in the mind of wanting to do the best possible job I could do and making sure that I fully captured from a social justice perspective the sort of access points for the records I was working with, right? So the material conditions of cataloging labor, I think, determine a lot about what can actually be done inside of a catalog record. So those are some of the solutions, and they're admirable, and I value them as efforts. I don't think that they can solve this fundamental paradox where at the end of the day I got to put a word on it and I got to put it somewhere, and that's not how knowledge is made. It's not how things are. These things are contextual and relational, and so it's not going to work. So what do we do? So I'm a teacher. I teach in the library. I teach people how to use these systems and structures, so I interact with them all day, every day, when I'm at work and not involved in a protracted labor dispute. And I'm always struck by how valuable I find the text of the catalog, especially in its most sort of horrifying moments, as a way of teaching a room full of students in a pretty benign and very accessible and material way about the ways that hidden ideologies or unexpressed ideologies structure everything, right? So it's not like library materials and library classification is the only arena where hidden assumptions about how the world ought to work that come from people, that come from whiteness, that come from patriarchy, that come from sort of class distinctions, right? Like, you see it at work at the DMV, right? So I was going to take the train up, and I ended up having to take the bus because of a train derailment, and I didn't want to take the bus. Do you know why I didn't want to take the bus? Because I make too much money to take the bus, right? So it's like the social class distinctions around the train and the bus. I was really struck by being forced into the bus category, right? And so even there, the kind of shape of the line and where the ticket was and how little information you get on the bus and how I'm going to go take the bus tomorrow and I'm apparently going to go stand on a corner. And how are they going to inform me about the lateness of my bus? Probably not very well, right? So all of that is ideologically constructed just the same way the catalog is. And so I guess the case I would make in the last 2 minutes that I'm going to be talking to you is that the library catalog and classification structure, because it is so easy to read the ideology in it, as we've seen on the panel so far, it makes it a really productive teaching tool for introducing students to the fact that ideology structures systems that we all have to intersect with every day. So I guess I'll close with that. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, so thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for such a wonderful panel. As Sara mentioned, I'm coming to this conversation kind of outside of field. I work on 19th century literature, but I first became interested in these questions through discussions among literary scholars and historians of the 19th century of the archive, not only in terms of the content that we can kind of get from it, but also kind of increasingly and especially coming out of digital humanities projects, how can we sort of think critically about the structures of the archives that were created in the 19th century, the ones that are being created right now? So sort of with that in mind, I just wanted to start off with a question for all of you about, our particular moment right now. What are the possibilities in terms of digital projects, whether it's in terms of enabling more sort of user-driven content or community cataloging, or possibilities for engaging with students? How do you see that potentially sort of shaping these discussions about the politics of the catalog in the library? Let's start.
I'll go first. I'm deeply suspicious. in part because I think we have fantasies about the digital as making a lot of access possible in ways that aren't ideological, right? That because users can engage in different ways and but I think what we also run the risk is of producing a text that none of us can read, right? So like Google results are equally ideologically informed. Code is ideologically informed. The difference is that I can't read it. I can't read it because I'm not a computer scientist, and I can't read it because it's owned by Google. It's a private corporation, and we would have to be involved in. What would a protracted labor dispute at Google look like that would reveal that to us? I don't even know. So I guess those are my concerns about the digital. That it masks the ideology that goes behind the building of search and retrieval systems.
I would totally agree with that. And there's actually a woman named Sophia Noble at UCLA who does a lot of research in this area. And one of her points is that I think that the danger in that is most people aren't aware of that. Most people aren't aware that, or don't really think about systems having all of our prejudices and biases and our own worldview get built right into these systems, and we don't think about it and we don't question it. So I do think there is that potential. It's really something to be aware of. So I think I'm a little more hopeful. I think that there is possibility. I think there are data standards, emerging data standards and metadata standards that will make it easier to let anyone say anything about anything, and to allow other kinds of linkages and that sort of thing, but only if we make sure that we're not building the same kinds of limitations into new systems. Like I think that it's something that we do have to think really critically about and be aware of, and particularly since a lot of us are not programmers and we're not the ones doing the building. And a lot of that community, that IT community, looks very homogenous, and so the same kind of ideologies get built into those systems. So it's another plug for diversity and lots of different kinds of perspectives in IT, I think.
Getting back to the user engagement portion of your question, there are a number of library catalogs that whose software allow users to actually, enter their own terminology. We know this is social tagging, which for diehard catalogers like myself is anathema. Even though it may actually help some users to find information, but it's sort of like the wild, wild west when you don't have controlled vocabulary or uniformity. I think it makes retrieval a little bit more difficult.
I would just add, I think that I'm just going to speak from an example in the context of the digital humanities class this semester. And one thing that we found useful, even though it did mean using a Google tool, like using Google Maps, we had students, because we have data about, in some cases, zip codes in which zines were published, we asked the students to make maps visualizing, for these different collections in the Pioneer Valley, where in different years were zines being published. And I think one of the great learning moments of that experience, in order to make this map that looks a lot like maps they see all of the time, the students had to start with the spreadsheets. And we have at least one of our students here who knows the pain of starting with the spreadsheet that, in many cases the zip codes weren't there, the location, or they didn't work, or trying to enter data from outside the United States, or figuring out just how do we have to clean all of this up to make the map appear in this really simple, user-friendly tool. And recognizing how much they couldn't show and where the limits were, and that there was nowhere on the Google map for you to have a little asterisk and a statement about well, here are the conditions that structure what could be here, and here's who we consulted, and here's how we decided what to include and what to exclude, and here's how many people's zines just they didn't put a location, so we'll never know. But I think having them do that work and this is very similar to the cataloging, I guess this is one of my thoughts, is just having students do some analogous work to see what goes into producing something at a larger scale. Our hope is that then when they look at more visualizations, they'll be aware, oh, there are actually a lot of choices being made here. There's a lot happening underneath this really smooth, flat surface that, again, humans did. And it's a lot more labor to stop and create, the frame for your map where you explain everything, and like that's also part of, I think, what they'll be realizing when it goes up online on a website or something, that then we have to do that next part. Yeah.
Are there questions from the audience?
So I have a question, and I think it's sort of a kind of technical question. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding. So when, say, the Library of Congress switches to, it was non-citizens and unauthorized immigrants, those were the two ones?
Immigration, yeah.
Is that for every book that gets cataloged from that point on, or is it everything previously to that as well?
Yes, that is a technical question, and the problem is...
Well, I have a historical question about that then.
Okay. When one heading is replaced by two, it makes it much more difficult because there can be an automatic flip. So illegal aliens will be automatically flipped to non-citizens, but then you lose the unauthorized immigration portion. There would have to be some sort of algorithm created whereby unauthorized immigration could be added to those records.
So, but when you change something to make it sort of more, like, as Emily might suggest, like, we're better people in the future, I mean, the categories may or may not have existed in the past. So if you take the non-citizen category, say if it's a book about Filipinos, there's a moment in time when they could be unauthorized immigrants, but citizens, or they could be non-citizens. Do you get what I'm saying? The categories don't necessarily match. And so if you're changing a book from the 1920s that doesn't represent the current categories that we use, how do you address that kind of issue? It's like, I think a good question for the Native American sources, like, sometimes these categories are historically created at this moment. They didn't exist in the past, and so how do you sort of reflect the need to do historical research based on categories that we don't use anymore? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And it's acknowledged that the solution that they come up with is not ideal, and
Right.
and you've just identified one of the problems with it. Yeah.
But I think, but John, can't you can leave traces of the former headings, right? So that I could search against.
The former headings will continue to exist in the authority record as C references.
But will they exist on the book? They won't.
They might
Okay.
exist on the book if in transcription if they appear in, like, say, a contents note or in the title.
So
Otherwise,
so
no.
you're making a decision
Yeah.
that a historian using that language, because like you would want to, like, I can see a setting where you'd want all the books about Negroes because you wanted to pull books that were written from that. Yeah, so you're making a decision about what kind of access you're enabling. Yeah. Interesting.
I really appreciated Emily's, as Catalog manager, really appreciated Emily's points on contracted labor issues to the expense. But I want to throw out something that I think that I'm also hearing in these last questions, which is that library technology sucks.
Yeah.
And so there's the human labor, and then there's our technology and our tools should facilitate. So a lot of the decisions the Library of Congress is making is based on work. How much work would need to be done to make those changes? And because we don't have good technology to support that work, that holds up a lot of decisions that, as John said, there are a lot of individuals at LC who are personally supportive. But it holds up the institutional ability to move forward. And so I just wanted to note that as an additional problem, challenge as we face.
I mean, I do feel like one problem with crowdsourcing of tagging or tagging projects is, I think if anybody has ever looked up their favorite performer on YouTube, let's face it, 80% of those videos are someone in their basement. And they may not even be imitating your favorite performer. They just want you to look at their video. So, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of problems with that, and YouTube is a great example of how poorly things can be tagged. But at the same time, it's very inhibiting as a cataloger to try to work your topic around the LC subject headings. So I wondered my whole life, why don't more libraries have an uncontrolled subject field that has, it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to sort perfectly, it doesn't have to, it could just be a free text keyword search. And so, like, as someone who's spent a lot, like 4 years cataloging materials on the history of women, the existing, if I wanted to use the existing OCLC record, and I was supposed to do a lot of books, they all have the same subject heading, women's social conditions. So if you look at any academic catalog under women's social conditions, you have more entries than you can retrieve. So it's not useful. So we would, at the same time, if we get something that's a work of fiction, we'll give it 6 subject headings. So it's very frustrating, and I don't actually still to this day understand why we don't institute more uncontrolled headings that we could assign when we have the material in hand and we actually know what it's about.
So for the catalogers out there, how many of you know about the 653 field? Anybody? Yes. Okay. So, you do. Okay. So that's one solution. I mean, the problem with the 653, I mean, you could put anything in there, any terminology you want, but then what do you do with it? Where do you index it? Do you display it? So on. But that is built into the MARC format.
Right. It's just not used.
Yeah.
I think would the problem be solved if we educated our users about authority records, so that you would allow the authority record to have any kind of social tagging you wanted, because you'd still be referring back to the term that's actually used. And I think that's a really strong tool that would even solve the historian's problem of being able to track when the headings changed, how the headings changed, where other headings might have been related even before your own study. That's a tool we all use, and we keep that so secret from the public, but that's really the primary controlling factor in all of our records is the authority record.
I have 2 things. I'm not a librarian. I'm co-teaching this class that has been alluded to with Alana and also Leslie. I don't know if you're around. But I'm a professor at Hampshire, so I'm like learning all this stuff really recently, and it's been really exciting. I have two questions. One is about some of the folks who are doing, trying to create a zine library, a zine union catalog, are trying to use something that I just learned about, so I don't know much about it. I want to ask you. Linked open data, where it seemed like replacing the idea of an authority record with, so instead of the use instead of, that they're all just available and maybe visible. I'm not exactly sure it works. I wondered if any of you have anything to say about that. And then the second thing was, and just thinking about the YouTube video comment, was that I'm pretty amazed these days with Google, something like a Google algorithm, a search algorithm, where I can put in something misspelled or adjacent to the thing I'm looking for, and it will kind of figure out what I'm maybe looking for and kind of direct me in that way. And I was wondering if that kind of search algorithm, while also being something that you can't read if you don't know how to look at algorithms, it does seem like also library databases have become a little bit more savvy in understanding what I'm trying to do, but not as much as Google. So that's how I do my library research. So yeah, the 2 things, the linked open data and algorithms, if any of you have commented.
So I'm super excited to see somebody in the audience actually drop the term linked open data. And a non-librarian. That's actually what I was alluding to when I said anyone can say anything about anything. That's like one of the metadata schema that underlies, or the metadata scheme that underlies linked open data is called RDF, Resource Description Framework. And one of the concepts is that anyone can say anything about anything, and you should support that. And so, for example, the New York Public Library is using it as a basis for a system where anyone can say anything. So to let people add data to records and still be able to keep track of, where did this data come from, where did this data come from, so that not only can you have all of these different ways of describing or making relationships between these things, but you can also keep track of what was the source of them, or not in a non-privacy way, but kind of like, okay, this came from the library and this came externally, or that sort of thing. So I do think there's the potential there. Sorry, I think I lost sight of your question because I got so excited about linked open data.
Oh, algorithms. One of the things that I find most fascinating about Google is that I am a lesbian, and I actually have to put in extra words to get lesbian porn, right? Like, it knows me well enough to know that I'm probably looking for social services or like a political organization. So its power to make judgments about what it thinks I'm looking for, I find really unsettling, because I don't know how it's working, and yeah.
I won't go into a lot of detail, but as many of you know, there are efforts underway right now, primarily with the Library of Congress and OCLC, to transform library catalogs by including linked open data within the catalogs themselves. And I won't go into a lot of details, but it's still in development, though.
People tell me it's the answer. I have, like Amber Billy, this one cataloging friend, tells me it's the answer. She really is like, sure.
I mean, I do think, again, it depends on what we do with it and how we build the systems around it, because there will still need to be systems supporting linked open data and how those linkages happen and that sort of thing. So, like, I don't think linked open data is going to be any more this neutral thing that we think everything else is than everything else is. That didn't make sense, but you know what I mean.
I agree with you. Yeah.
I also want to just follow up on what you were saying about Google, and this is something that I always forget too. If I do a Google search and you do a Google search, the exact same search, our results are going to be completely different, and that is super secret and super scary.
But probably not that different. I mean, it's just the echo chamber. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Kelsey, right?
Yeah.
So this is probably just because I don't really understand the system or the theory behind it, and also because I have a love-hate relationship with categories in general. But I just wondered, do you worry at all when you're putting extra labels on someone that you are, especially like with the fictional stories, and again, they're probably not people looking up the fictional stories just to read, they're looking up the purpose, but do you worry that you're affecting how you're like kind of prescribing a lens that people are supposed to see this work through? Whereas if I was an author and I wrote a fictional story, I just want the story.
Right.
You know?
Well, and do you want to be more than a Dene author? Right. Do you want to just be an author? Like that? Is that part of the question too?
Uniformly apply those extra labels. You know, where one guy's a guy and the other guy is an American Indian guy.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, that just took me on a tangent, but somebody in their children's literature reviews decided that they were going to start always saying white so-and-so. This story is about a white girl who blah, 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 and because they always said it for other people. Yeah. Do I worry? Yeah, I mean, not to be flippant, but I mean, I do think, and I can't speak for like the catalogers who are actually involved with this, but I will say that the catalogers and metadata people here who've worked on this collection and are thinking about this project more broadly have talked a lot about, we worry that we've done too much, or we haven't done enough, or we've done the wrong thing, and that I've read something about like what to do if you're an ally and that sort of thing, and it's like you're gonna make mistakes, and try to own those mistakes, like that recognize you're gonna make mistakes, and so yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, I think I have a lot to learn. I think we have a lot to learn, but we weren't having these conversations before. I think the key is to start bringing the conversations. And this is, again, something that is not my idea. This is something that came up at the meeting that really has stuck with me, is it shouldn't just be about what we're doing in these systems, but how can we, how can this also be a part of the larger conversation? Or, it should be a two-way street, not so much where, we're bringing knowledge to these tribal communities, but also like how can these indigenous ways of thinking be used in completely non-indigenous projects? And that's something I've been thinking about a lot. And so, again, I feel like I'm getting away far from your question, but yes, I worry. Yes, I think we have a lot to learn, and I think that the more we keep having the conversations, the better. And that, thankfully, because we're not printing out catalog cards anymore, we can make changes if we need to.
The other thing is that we're making these collections discoverable. I mean, we're not having year-long conversations, we're actually putting materials out there. So better to put them out there and have these conversations than to say, I cataloged one book in the Native American collection, but I had a lot of conversations about a subject matter. And I think that's an important balance that catalogers today have than they did years ago. There's so much more undiscovered materials, the flywheel collection. I mean, that would never years ago have been cataloged, discovered, described in any way whatsoever. So I think the more of this we can get out there, then we can have conversations about, we shouldn't have done it that way, can we change it? Or at least it got out there. And I think that's really significant. I think that's a real goal and challenge for catalogers today is how much time can I spend on this? What's more important, getting it out there or getting it out there perfect?
With this collection in particular also, we're thinking about balancing the needs between the local collection as itself. So as the librarian who's often teaching the Eisenberg collection to undergraduates, and to think about, well, it actually does, if they read Sherman Alexi's Flight last week, and they're thinking about, well, what are the intellectual pathways to get to other kinds of fiction by Native authors, then we're thinking about our local community here, which is what every library should be thinking about is how do we meet our community here, but then when we go to digitize books and the fantastic catalog records go with them, then we're thinking about that balance between us as one node of a much larger network that's going to be taken in a completely different context.
I just want to say one thing about like the marked and unmarked thing that I think you're getting at with your question, that like only some of us are different enough to need to be described, right? Like it was a real chance. So my protracted labor dispute is that I was locked out by my employer. I had to go to the police precinct to get a bullhorn permit, a sound permit for our bullhorn for our rally, where we were like, are you kidding me? And they gave me a strike permit, right? Because there's no language for a lockout because there's no such thing as like locking us out, right? So the permit is a strike permit, not a lockout permit. We got our COBRA letters and it said our health insurance had been cut because of an LIUFF, that's our union, LIUFF labor action. And so there's language for striking, but there's no language for a management act because management is not marked. So I think your question, like I would love to see the proliferation of headings for white people and rich people in management and corporate, like that stuff to become enough of an area of analysis so that the lens was turned a little bit. And I know we're over time, but I did want to respond to that.
Yeah. And I would say that's probably a great way to wrap up and maybe continue the discussion in the back. Thank you so much.